In the unforgiving world of the Middle Ages, peasants scraped by on what the land, the forest, and sheer determination could provide. With little more than roots, grains, and grit, they managed to feed their families, one wooden bowl at a time. Today, I'm honoring those forgotten cooks, mothers, fathers, and field hands who turned near starvation into survival and mealtime into a quiet act of strength. Pottage. It always started with pottage. If there was a backbone to the medieval peasant's table, this was it. A bubbling, shifting, endlessly adaptable stew that lived on the hearth like a member of the family. It wasn't so much a recipe as it was a way of life. Every morning, the pot was lit again. Every night, it simmered until sleep. Into it went whatever could be spared. Nothing was measured, nothing was wasted, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was ever thrown away. The base was humble grain, usually barley or oats, maybe spelt if you were lucky. These were soaked or boiled down into a thick, gluey porridge, sometimes barely more than gruel. To this, vegetables were added as the seasons allowed, leeks and onions in the spring, cabbage and turnips in the winter, carrots if they hadn't yet been claimed by the frost. And if the gods smiled and you lived near a forest, maybe a few mushrooms would find their way in, bringing their dark, earthy perfume to the bubbling brew. Herbs gave it a lift, whatever grew wild along the hedgerows. Sorrel, parsley, nettles. A little sage if someone had traded well at market. Salt was precious, sometimes absent entirely, and meat was a luxury almost too rare to name. But when a neighbor's pig was slaughtered or a bone could be spared from the Lord's table, it was celebrated. That bone, clean or not, was plunged into the pot and coaxed to give up every last drop of flavor it held. Pottage wasn't made for beauty. It was brown, always brown. It slumped in bowls like it had worked the fields too, but it filled the belly and warmed the fingers and tasted different every day, because every day the pot changed. Fresh leeks one day, leftover peas the next, a spoon of yesterday's gruel stirred back in to thicken it anew. It was never the same meal twice, and yet it was always pottage. This was food that stayed alive as long as you did. A hearth companion, a survival spell in a ceramic bowl, a poor man's answer to hunger, spoken in spoonfuls. If you were sick, you had pottage. If you were hungry, you had pottage. If you were celebrating, well, you probably still had pottage, maybe just with a bit of marrow scraped in. It didn't matter if it was thin or thick, bland or bold, it kept you going. And in the Middle Ages, that was the whole point. Barley bread. If pottage was the soul of the peasant's table, barley bread was its backbone. Dense, dark, and just barely risen, it was the daily loaf that carried entire generations through famine, frost, and feudal dews. Wheat, the grain of kings and monasteries, was a stranger to the common folk. But barley grew where wheat turned up its nose. It didn't mind the poor soil or the cold rain, and it answered hunger with quiet reliability. There was nothing fluffy or photogenic about barley bread. It was coarse, thick, and sometimes as tough as the hands that baked it. But it was sturdy, and in a world of back-breaking labor, sturdiness mattered more than softness. In most villages, baking wasn't a solo act. Peasants prepared their dough at home and carried it, wrapped in cloth or tucked into baskets, to the communal oven, often operated by the local lord or reeve, who took a cut of every loaf for the privilege. To stretch the barley and to make sure nothing went to waste, folks often added mashed beans, ground oats, or even acorn flour, leached and dried painstakingly to remove their bitter bite. These additions gave the bread heft, added protein, and thickened the crust to a toothy chew that stuck to your ribs for hours. Sometimes a crust of barley bread was dunked in ale for breakfast. Sometimes it was rubbed with garlic and eaten with a smear of curd cheese or dipped straight into pottage, softening into something warm and spoonable. Barley flour didn't rise much, it lacked the gluten of wheat, so the loaves came out squat and firm, like bricks of survival. Some were flat and round, like stones, others oval and pinched at the ends. When they grew stale, and they always did, people soaked them in broth, fried them in a bit of lard, or grated them back into porridge. Every crumb mattered. Nothing was wasted. The hard heel of a week-old loaf might find its way into the next stew. The soft middle, if any was left, became an offering for a neighbor in need. Even the crusts were fed to chickens or pigs, returning to the cycle that sustained the whole household. It didn't taste like the bakery loaves we know today. It was nutty, sour, sometimes slightly bitter, depending on what else was mixed in. But it was honest food. food that knew the value of the earth, the warmth of an oven, and the ache of a long day's labor. In every bite, there was grit, and in that grit, there was life. Onion and leek pie. Long before buttery crusts and golden pastries lined our cookbooks, there was a simpler pie, one filled with the hum of the earth and the scent of the morning's harvest. Onion and leek pie was a dish born of necessity, coaxed from gardens and field edges, made rich not with meat or cheese, but with sheer aroma. It was the kind of pie that filled the cottage with the smell of warmth, even when the hearth had no fire to spare. Leeks and onions were two of the most beloved crops of the medieval peasant. Hardy, easy to grow, and patient with poor soil, they pushed up green through the cold seasons and kept their bite long into storage. In the absence of spices or stock, their sharpness became flavor's anchor. Chopped fine and sweated down slowly, they turned mellow and sweet, releasing a perfume that made even a poor meal feel like a feast. The crust was no delicate pastry. It was a rough dough of barley or rye flour, kneaded with water and perhaps a drop of oil or lard, if any could be spared. Sometimes the crust was baked hard like a shell and discarded after use, more container than coarse. But if the pie was meant to feed a family, the crust was eaten too, chewy and dark at the edges, soaking up the rich oniony juices like a sponge. The filling was modest but satisfying. Sliced onions, chopped leeks, perhaps a bit of garlic, or a handful of wild herbs if they were in season. If the hens had been generous, an egg might be cracked in to bind the mixture. A spoonful of curds or stale cheese rind, now that was true luxury. But even without those extras, the pie was fragrant and deeply flavorful in a way only slow cooking can provide. It was often baked in the same oven used for communal bread, tucked to one side, catching the leftover heat. As it baked, the smell would drift down lanes and across fields, a sharp and savory whisper that something good was coming to the table that night. Children would hover, noses tilted toward the hearth, waiting for the moment the crust gave way and the filling steamed free. There was nothing extravagant in it, but it didn't need to be. This was peasant ingenuity at its best, turning two humble vegetables into a centerpiece, into something to gather around. In that hot, fragrant slice, there was care, there was resourcefulness, and there was the quiet, unspoken promise that tonight, at least, there would be enough to go around. Peas porridge. Hot in the pot, 9 days old. That old nursery rhyme wasn't joking. Peas porridge was the kind of meal that lingered, reheated again and again, thickening with time and taking on the stubborn character of the pot it lived in. But long before it became a sing-song line for children, peas porridge was a lifeline, a dish as plain as dirt and just as essential. It was one of the few reliable sources of protein for medieval peasants who couldn't afford meat, and it carried them through cold months and hungry weeks with quiet endurance. At its heart, peas porridge was simply cooked peas, not the green garden variety we know today, but dried field peas, yellow, tan, or mottled brown. Tough little things that stored well and softened slowly, perfect for feeding a family long after the harvest had passed. They were soaked overnight in water drawn from the well, then simmered for hours in the hearth's heat until they collapsed into a thick, creamy mash. The taste? Earthy, faintly sweet, and deeply comforting, like a woolen blanket in a bowl. If you had salt, it went in. If not, a sprig of thyme or crushed mustard seeds might stand in. Sometimes a knuckle bone or bit of bacon rind would be added for richness and pulled out before serving. Most days, though, it was just peas, water, and patience. Once cooled, peas porridge took on a whole new form. It firmed up into a solid, sliceable slab, something that could be fried on a hot stone, packed into a bundle for the fields, or eaten cold by candlelight with a hunk of coarse bread. It traveled well. It filled the belly. And best of all, it could be made in large batches and stretched across the week. The longer it sat, the thicker and heartier it became, and no one seemed to mind. There was a rhythm to it. Soak the peas, boil the peas, stir the pot, serve the bowl, and repeat. Children grew up on it. Their bones and teeth formed on its starch. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable, and that mattered more than flavor in a world where the next meal was never promised. Peas porridge was a quiet kind of magic, transforming hard, dry pulses into something soft and sustaining. It taught patience, thrift, and the deep satisfaction of a warm meal that stuck to your ribs and didn't ask much in return. And for those who knew hunger, that was more than enough. Nettles and wild green stew. Before cultivated kale and trendy spinach took over modern kitchens, peasants turned to the hedgerows and meadows for their greens. Nettles, sorrel, dandelion, and goosefoot. These weren't weeds back then. They were dinner. Wild greens were nature's spring offering, pushing up through thawing soil when cellars ran bare and salted roots grew tired. And one of the most enduring ways to use them was in a simple, nourishing wild greens stew, earthy, bitter, and green as life itself. Nettles were the star. Yes, the same stinging nettles that give rashy memories to barefoot wanderers, but once boiled, their sting vanished, leaving behind a flavor not unlike spinach, but with more depth, a little minerally, a little grassy, and deeply satisfying. Peasants knew where to find the good patches, picking young nettle tops before they grew tough or bitter. They'd gather them by the armful, careful with cloth-wrapped fingers or wooden tongs, and bring them home like a gift from the forest. Into the pot went those nettles, washed and chopped, along with other wild greens that had been foraged that morning. Sorrel added a tangy sharpness, while dandelion leaves brought bitterness that was tempered by slow cooking. Chickweed, plantain, fat hen, whatever grew in reach was fair game. If the family kept a garden, cultivated leeks or spring onions might be thrown in for extra savor. The base of the stew was modest: water, maybe a handful of barley or oats to thicken it, a crushed clove of garlic if any was left over. Fat was rare, but if a bit of lard or dripping could be spared, it would lift the whole pot into something richer. Salt was a treasure, but sometimes the greens were boiled in a light brine or finished with a splash of vinegar or fermented ale for brightness. The result was a bowl full of green, dense, pungent, and invigorating. It wasn't delicate. It was bold and slightly bitter, with a flavor that woke up the tongue and reminded you that spring had come. The stew brought strength after winter, iron and vitamins the body had long been craving, and it filled the belly with something that felt like renewal. Children weren't always eager, of course. Greens were an acquired taste, but mothers knew what they were doing. They'd spoon the stew into wooden bowls and press bread into the sides to soak up the broth, and slowly, bite by bite, the wild, weedy stew would disappear. It was a meal that cost nothing but time and care, a dish not planted but gathered, a reminder that even in the leanest times, the land still gave if you knew where to look. Dried herring and oats. When you lived far from the sea, fish was a memory, not a meal, but dried herring changed that. Thanks to medieval trade routes and an impressive network of salting and curing, preserved herring made its way from the coasts into the bellies of peasants across the continent. It wasn't fresh, and it certainly wasn't fancy, but it was fish, and for those who rarely tasted meat, that made all the difference. Dried herring arrived stiff and leathery, packed in barrels of salt or bundled in tight coils. It smelled strong, sharp, briny, and deeply marine. But it was cheap, it was protein, and it lasted. That was more than enough. Most villages could afford a barrel once in a while, often shared or split among families, with each home getting a few fillets to ration through the week. To prepare it, the fish was soaked first, usually overnight in fresh water or watered-down ale, to pull out some of the salt and soften the texture. Then it was either boiled, grilled over flame, or gently fried if fat could be spared. The result was still firm, still salty, but now edible. Flaky in places, chewy in others, and full of ocean intensity that clung to the lips and lingered on the breath. Herring on its own was strong, sometimes overwhelmingly so. That's where oats came in. Peasants would cook up a batch of oat porridge, thick, warm, and bland as stone, and serve the herring alongside, or flake it directly into the pot. The oats mellowed the salt and stretched the portion. One small fish might flavor a whole pot, feeding 4 or 5 people from a single fillet. Other times, the herring would be shredded and spread onto coarse oatcakes, baked on hot stones or in ashes. The warm, grainy flatbread softened the fish and turned it into a meal that could be eaten by hand, in the field, or by the hearth. Some households kept a bowl of cold oats on the table and let everyone crumble their bit of herring on top as they pleased. The flavor was bold, sour, smoky, sea-salted. It clung to the palate and filled the house with its unmistakable scent. Not everyone loved it, but no one turned it down. It was strength in a small package, nourishment tucked into the folds of a frugal life. Dried herring and oats weren't elegant, but they were dependable. In a landlocked village, they were a taste of something far away, a reminder that trade, like hunger, traveled. And in that modest bowl of fish and grain, there was both endurance and connection. Curd cheese and rye cakes. When the milk came in and the pail sloshed heavy from the cow or goat, a peasant family had only a short window to use it before spoilage set in. With no refrigeration and limited vessels, dairy had to be transformed quickly, stretched, soured, or stored by clever hands. And one of the most common transformations was curd cheese, soft, fresh, and faintly tangy, made with little more than time and warmth. Paired with hot rye cakes off the griddle, it made a meal that was modest in ingredients but rich in comfort. Curd cheese was born of simplicity. Milk was left to rest until it naturally separated, curds thickening like clouds, whey weeping beneath. Some households added a splash of vinegar or a bit of soured milk to speed the process. Once curdled, the mixture was ladled into cloth and hung to drip, the whey falling away like a thin, sour broth. What remained was creamy, lumpy cheese, mild in flavor, just a little tart, with a texture that spread easily but held its shape. It was rarely salted, unless salt was on hand. More often, it was left plain or mixed with chopped herbs, chives, garlic greens, or a little parsley if the garden was kind. Some added mashed beans or leeks for bulk, turning it into more of a spread than a cheese. However it came out, it was best enjoyed fresh, before it turned too sharp. Rye cakes were the natural companion. Rye flour was darker, heavier, and more forgiving than wheat, growing in poorer soil and colder climates. Mixed with water and cooked on a flat stone or griddle over the hearth, these cakes were dense and toothy, sometimes crisp around the edges, sometimes soft and steaming depending on the thickness. They bore the scent of the fire, smoky, earthy, faintly sour. A spoonful of curd cheese on a warm rye cake was a meal in itself, not elaborate, not sweet, but nourishing and deeply rooted in the rhythms of rural life. It might be breakfast or the midday meal or the small bite taken before sleep. Children licked their fingers, wiping smears of cheese on sleeves. Mothers wrapped leftovers in cloth for the next day's work in the fields. It wasn't celebratory food, it was everyday food, and that was its power. It reminded you that something soft and good could still be coaxed from hard soil and cold mornings. A spoon, a cake, a smear of cheese, and suddenly, a quiet kind of joy. Cabbage and turnip hot pot. When the cold winds blew through the thatch and the sun disappeared before supper, the peasant kitchen leaned on its most reliable friends, cabbage and turnips. Humble, hardy, and nearly impossible to kill, these two root vegetables were the winter's backbone. Together, they made a hot pot that wasn't glamorous, but was undeniably satisfying. Steamed breath rising from a wooden bowl, earthy and sweet, smelling like survival. Cabbage was the garden's gift that kept on giving. It stored well, especially when salted or hung in a cool corner, and it softened beautifully when stewed. Its thick green leaves, tightly packed like fists, unraveled in the pot, releasing a scent that was equal parts nourishing and bold. Turnips, knobby and pale, added a starchy hardiness. Their sharpness mellowed when boiled, turning sweet and almost buttery with enough cooking. The hot pot itself was more of a method than a recipe. Into a clay or iron pot went chopped cabbage, diced turnips, and often a handful of onions or leeks, if any were lying around. Water was added just enough to cover the bottom, and then it simmered low and slow over the hearth. If the family had saved a bone, perhaps from last week's feast or borrowed from a neighbor, it would be dropped in to lend richness. If not, a splash of ale or a spoon of lard might fill in. Herbs were foraged or grown in small window boxes, thyme, savory, wild mustard leaves. Garlic was a treat, but found its way in when possible. Some days, the hot pot was thin like soup. Other days, it cooked down to a chunky mash, spooned thick over bread or oatcakes. Its form was flexible, its purpose constant. This wasn't the kind of meal people wrote poems about, but it filled the house with a smell that meant someone was looking out for you. It warmed frozen fingers and settled churning bellies. It was the kind of dinner that went silent once served, just the sound of spoons clinking, the quiet satisfaction of something hot after a cold day. Cabbage and turnip hot pot didn't aim to impress. It aimed to comfort. It was born of soil and cellar, of tradition and thrift. It was what you ate when money was gone and snow piled at the door. But in its own quiet way, it was everything a meal needed to be. Simple, honest, and made with care. A stew of 2 vegetables and 1,000 years of wisdom behind them. Baked egg custard. Eggs were a quiet treasure in the medieval peasant's kitchen. Small, humble, and easy to overlook, but worth their weight in gold when hens were laying. On ordinary days, they were eaten simply, boiled, poached, or fried if fat could be spared. But when luck, timing, and just a touch of surplus aligned, something truly special came to the table. That something was baked egg custard, a rare and silky indulgence, born not of wealth, but of careful gathering and quiet celebration. The custard began with milk, fresh from the cow or goat, still warm if possible. Into this was stirred a handful of beaten eggs, whisked by hand with a stick or carved spoon, a pinch of salt, sometimes a touch of ground nutmeg if the local monastery traded spices, and, on festive days, a drizzle of honey or a bit of coarse sugar if such luxury had been bartered or saved. The mixture was poured into a shallow clay dish and nestled near the coals, or placed in the village bake oven after the bread came out, letting the residual heat slowly work its magic. As it baked, the custard firmed just enough to hold its shape, trembling slightly when touched, golden at the edges and gently puffed at the center. The smell was gentle and warm, milk, earth, and sweetness mingling with the scent of baked crusts and smoldering wood. If there was no honey, the custard was served plain, smooth and faintly eggy, its richness still a revelation to mouths used to turnips and gruel. This was not an everyday dish. It was a birth treat, a feast day pleasure, a gift for the sick, or an offering made in thanks. Sometimes it was cooked in smaller ramekins, shared in tiny spoonfuls. Other times it was cut into wedges and served with bread to stretch it farther. It didn't last long, and it wasn't meant to. Its rarity made each bite linger longer. Children loved it, elders cherished it, and even the most calloused workers would pause to savor its delicate texture, to marvel at how just 3 ingredients, milk, eggs, and fire, could produce something so soft, so kind to the tongue. It was proof that even in a world ruled by hardship and hunger, there were still small moments of grace. Baked egg custard was more than a sweet. It was a whisper of gentleness in a hard world, a reminder that comfort could still be coaxed from the simplest things when given time, care, and just a bit of warmth. Oat gruel. In the early light of a gray medieval morning, before the cows were milked and the fields called out for hands, there was oat gruel. Thin, warm, and unassuming, it was the peasant's breakfast. A quiet start to a long day, as ordinary as the rising sun. There were no spices, no toppings, no choices. Just oats, water, and heat. And yet, in its own way, it was dependable, comforting, and oddly dignified. Gruel was not porridge, though they shared a common soul. Porridge had thickness, the kind that clung to the spoon and held shape in a bowl. Gruel was the thinner sibling, more broth than meal, more sip than bite. Made from finely ground oats or pinhead groats, it was stirred into boiling water and cooked slowly over the hearth, just until the mixture became cloudy and the oats began to bloom. It slid from spoon to mouth like a whisper, tasting of grain and smoke and little else. If milk was available, and it often wasn't, it was stirred in for richness. Some mornings saw the addition of a scrap of stale bread crumbled in, or a knob of fat if the larder allowed. On rare occasions, a dash of honey would appear, turning the humble bowl into something approaching a treat. But for most, oat gruel was simplicity itself, plain, hot, and filling enough to carry you through the early hours. Served in wooden bowls and eaten with carved spoons, it was shared in silence. The fire would crackle, hens might cluck outside, and steam would rise in soft plumes as families slurped and sighed. There was no fuss about it, no pride in preparation, no boasting of flavor. Gruel was a habit, a ritual, a reliable ritual in a world where few things could be counted on. Leftovers, if any, would be left to cool, firming up into a gelatinous cake that could be sliced and fried the next day. Nothing was wasted, not even gruel. And while it didn't excite the senses, it steadied them. It was warm when the world was cold, and full when the cupboard was bare. Oat gruel was the peasant's alarm clock, the farmer's first fuel. It asked for little and gave just enough. It didn't shine, but it showed up. Every morning, every season, every generation. And in that daily bowl of warm, watery oats was a kind of quiet perseverance, spooned out one ladle at a time. Blood pudding. When a pig was slaughtered in a medieval village, not a single part went to waste. Not the hooves, not the ears, and certainly not the blood. In fact, the blood was often the most prized element because it meant something truly sustaining could be made. Blood pudding. Dark, rich, and packed with nourishment, this dish was peasant frugality at its most ingenious, a way to stretch what little meat there was into meals that could last through the lean weeks ahead. Fresh pig's blood was collected warm, sometimes still steaming, stirred constantly to keep it from clotting. This was a sacred moment in its own way, not just because it signaled a rare source of food, but because it brought the village together. Neighbors would gather to help, share, and prepare. Blood pudding was almost always made in the wake of a community slaughter, a shared ritual of preservation and survival. To the blood was added a mix of whatever grains were on hand, typically oats or barley. These soaked up the liquid and gave the pudding its dense, filling texture. Herbs like sage or marjoram might be stirred in for flavor, and finely chopped onions were a common addition when available. Salt was essential, both for taste and preservation, though it was used sparingly if the supply was tight. The mixture was then stuffed into cleaned intestines, yes, the actual casing of the animal, or poured into cloth bags or pans if casings weren't an option. The pudding was boiled gently for hours, turning from a deep crimson to a nearly black brown as it cooked. Once set, it was cooled and sliced into thick rounds, ready to be fried on a hot stone or eaten cold with a heel of bread. Its flavor was strong, meaty, metallic, earthy, and hearty. For many, it was an acquired taste, but it was also an acquired strength. A few slices could fill a belly that had known too many empty days. Blood pudding was rarely spoken of with romance, but it was respected. It represented the full use of a life taken, a way of honoring the animal by feeding the entire household, perhaps even the whole village. It was food born from necessity, not desire, and it reminded people just how far they could stretch what they had when waste wasn't an option. In its dark, glistening slices was a story of survival. Blood turned to sustenance. Hunger turned to resilience. It wasn't pretty, but it was powerful. Stewed apples with honey. In a world without sugar bowls or sweet shops, dessert for the medieval peasant came from the orchard, the hive, and the hearth. Stewed apples with honey was one of those rare and gentle comforts, simple, soft, and touched with just enough sweetness to feel like a celebration. It wasn't an everyday treat, and it certainly wasn't elaborate. But when it appeared on the table, even in its most modest form, it brought smiles, silence, and the warm hush of something special. Apples were one of the few fruits that could be counted on to last through the cold months. After harvest, they were wrapped in straw or laid in cellars, where the chill kept them crisp for weeks, even months. As the fresh produce dwindled, these apples became the stars of the winter kitchen. They were eaten raw when still firm, sliced thin and dried in the sun, or slowly stewed when they began to soften and bruise. The preparation was humble. The apples were peeled or simply chopped, blemishes and all, and simmered in a clay pot over low heat with a bit of water or watered-down ale. As they cooked, they fell apart into golden pulp, releasing a sweet, tangy aroma that filled the house with a quiet cheer. If a spoonful of honey could be spared from the hive or bartered from a neighbor, it was stirred in at the end, just enough to soften the tartness and add a mellow, golden warmth. Some families added herbs like mint or sage, others a dash of vinegar for balance. On rare days, if the kitchen held cloves or cinnamon, spices traded from distant lands, they would be ground and sprinkled into the pot, turning the humble dish into something fit for a saint's feast. But even without those exotic touches, stewed apples stood tall. Their flavor was rich with memory, a mix of orchard air and wood smoke, of summer sunlight, carried into the cold months. The final dish could be spooned onto oatcakes, spread on barley bread, or eaten straight from the bowl with a wooden spoon. Children licked their lips, elders closed their eyes. It was soft, sweet, and generous. The kind of dish that reminded you life could still offer gentle things, even in hard times. Stewed apples with honey were more than a sweet ending. They were a soft middle in a life of hard edges, a warm, fragrant pause in the hunger, a gift from the tree, the bee, and the cook's steady hand. Mushroom and herb ragu. In the damp hush of the forest, beneath fallen leaves and mossy logs, peasants found a kind of quiet treasure, mushrooms. Not the tidy, uniform kind sold in today's stores, but wild, unruly, sometimes dangerous, and sometimes divine. For those who knew what to look for, and more importantly, what to avoid, mushrooms were a gift from the woods, earthy and mysterious, full of flavor that seemed to carry the soul of the soil itself. When gathered and stewed into a mushroom and herb ragu, they became a dish as rich in aroma as any roast, but drawn entirely from the forest floor. Gathering mushrooms wasn't done lightly. Folklore and caution hung thick around the task, passed down in whispered warnings and grandmother's rhymes. But for families who'd lived near the same woods for generations, certain varieties were trusted. chanterelles, shaggy inkcaps, field mushrooms, or wood bluets, depending on the region and season. They were brushed free of dirt with care, sometimes dried for later, but often used right away when fresh and fragrant. The ragout began with onions or leeks, chopped and slowly browned in whatever fat could be spared, usually lard or dripping saved from past meals. Into that went the sliced mushrooms, tossed gently until they released their juices and browned at the edges. The smell was something else entirely, rich, deep, almost meaty. If there was garlic, it was added next. Then came herbs, wild thyme, sage, or even crushed juniper berries, giving the stew a pungent, woodsy depth. To stretch it, a spoonful of coarse flour might be stirred in to thicken the sauce, followed by a splash of ale or weak vinegar. This turned the mushrooms into something more than a side, something that could fill a bowl, soak into bread, and warm a hungry belly. Some peasants would crumble stale oatcakes into the pot to absorb the flavor, making it heartier. Others served it with mashed beans or curd cheese to round it out. The dish was humble but layered. It tasted of damp leaves, firewood, and the cautious optimism of a good foraging day. It wasn't eaten often, because a mistake in picking could be deadly, but when done right, mushroom ragout was a reminder that the forest still gave freely to those who listened carefully and walked softly. In every spoonful was a bit of adventure, a touch of risk, and a whole lot of warmth. It was a meal that turned the woods into a kitchen, and the peasant into a quiet kind of alchemist, coaxing supper from the shadows. Garlic and bean mash. It was said you could smell a good meal before you saw it, and if garlic was involved, it was already halfway to being great, at least by peasant standards. Garlic, sharp and defiant, grew stubbornly in kitchen plots and tucked itself between rows of onions and leeks. It needed little tending and asked no favors from the soil, which made it perfect for a peasant's garden. And when combined with dried beans, boiled down and mashed together with care, it became something more than a side dish. Garlic and bean mash was a kind of kitchen alchemy, transforming two of the humblest ingredients into something bold, creamy, and surprisingly indulgent. Beans were a dependable crop, filling and easy to store. They were dried after harvest and kept in sacks or clay jars, ready to be soaked when needed. On most days, peasants would boil them until soft, with a bit of onion or wild herbs tossed in for flavor. But when time and ingredients allowed, they went one step further, draining the beans, mashing them to a coarse paste, and stirring in roasted garlic for a spread or mash that could rival anything found on a noble's table. The garlic was often roasted whole, skin on, nestled in the ashes of the hearth until it grew soft and mellow. The bite that raw garlic carried melted away, replaced by a deep sweetness and a rich, almost buttery texture. Pressed from its papery skin, it was mixed into the bean mash with a bit of lard, butter, or oil, if any could be found. The result was smooth and thick, flecked with bits of bean and golden garlic, tasting far richer than its ingredients would suggest. Sometimes a handful of chopped herbs, chervil, parsley, or sorrel, was stirred in at the end, or a splash of ale vinegar for brightness. The mash was served warm in a clay bowl, scooped onto flatbread or eaten with coarse barley cakes. For families short on bread, it was eaten by the spoonful, hot or cold, morning or night. It traveled well, made for good leftovers, and, perhaps best of all, it was entirely plant-based, making it perfect for meatless days during religious fasts. It filled the belly and left the mouth tingling. It was rustic, yes, but satisfying. And more than that, it was a reminder that flavor didn't belong only to the rich. It belonged to the earth, to those who knew how to coax it forward with little more than fire and time. Garlic and bean mash was not just a meal, it was a quiet rebellion against blandness, a dish that spoke loudly without needing much at all. Acorn bread. In the hush of the forest, beneath the broad arms of ancient oaks, lay one of the medieval peasants' least glamorous but most resourceful ingredients, the acorn. Hard, bitter, and hidden under a shell tough as a stone, acorns weren't the kind of food you reached for out of pleasure, but out of hunger. They were a gift. With no wheat and little barley to spare, peasants learned to stretch their flour with whatever the land gave freely. And acorn bread, dark and dense, was born from that ingenuity. Acorns were gathered in the fall, just after they dropped, often in baskets woven by hand. Children were usually the foragers, sent into the woods to scramble through leaves and pick them before the pigs got to them. But raw acorns couldn't be eaten as is. Their bitterness came from tannins, which made them nearly inedible without proper treatment. So the process began, slow and steady. First, the shells were cracked open with stones or mallets, revealing the pale, nutty meat inside. Then came the leaching. Acorns were soaked in cold water for days or boiled in changes of water, again and again, until the bitterness faded. Some families buried them in streams, letting the current wash out the tannins naturally. It was laborious, dull work, but it transformed something harsh into something edible. Once leached, the acorns were dried near the fire, then pounded into a coarse, rustic flour using mortars and pestles. This flour was rarely used on its own. It lacked the gluten needed to rise properly, but when mixed with barley, rye, or even ground beans, it formed the base of a dough. Water was added, sometimes a splash of milk or fat if available, and the mixture was shaped into rounds or flat loaves. The bread was baked on hot stones or in the village oven if you had access. It came out heavy and dark, with a rough, cracked crust and a nutty, earthy aroma. It wasn't soft, it wasn't pretty, but it kept well and it filled the belly. Eaten with broth, soaked in pottage, or spread with curd cheese, it became something more than the sum of its parts. Acorn bread was a food of last resorts and clever minds. It took patience, hard work, and the kind of wisdom passed down through generations who knew how to survive when the fields ran dry. Every loaf was a lesson. That even bitterness could be made nourishing, that even the forest floor could be turned into sustenance, if one only knew how to listen to the land. Leftover bone broth. Long after the meat was gone, long after the scraps had been picked clean, the skin crisped and the fat rendered, what remained was the bone. And to a medieval peasant, that was not the end of the meal, but the beginning of another. In cottages where hunger was a regular visitor and nothing could be wasted, leftover bones were never discarded. Instead, they were dropped into the pot, coaxed once more into giving what little they had left. Thus was born bone broth, thin, humble, and as close to sacred as food could get in a peasant's kitchen. The bones came from wherever they could be found: a pig's knuckle from a slaughtering day, a lamb shank once gnawed bare at the Lord's table and gifted down to the servants, even the spine of a fish or the split joint of a rabbit. If it had marrow, it was saved. If it had cartilage, it had value. Some bones were used again and again, simmered until they crumbled. The broth was made slowly, with care. The bones were placed into a pot of water and brought to a gentle boil, then simmered for hours, sometimes all day, over a low fire. As the bones softened, their essence seeped into the water, filling it with faint richness. If vegetables were on hand, they went in too: a knobby carrot, a tired onion, a leaf or two of cabbage. Garlic skins, herb stems, and even old bread crusts often made their way into the pot. Every addition brought a little more body, a little more depth. Salt, when available, was a gift. If not, a splash of sour ale or a scoop of fermented whey added tang and complexity. The broth might remain thin, barely more than a warm drink, or it might be thickened with barley, beans, or leftover pottage, turning it into a stew. On truly meager days, the broth alone was sipped as a tonic. Healing, hearty, and as close to nourishment as could be managed. It was food made from what others threw away, but in its warmth was something more than sustenance. There was ritual, hope, a belief that even the barest scraps could be transformed into comfort. Children would wrap cold fingers around their bowls, slurp the broth slowly, and feel it spread through their chests like a promise. Leftover bone broth wasn't flashy. It wasn't filling in the way a roast was, but it lingered. In scent, in memory, in the bones of those who drank it. It was a quiet kind of alchemy, taking the end of one meal and turning it into the beginning of another. Poached eggs in onion broth. There was something almost reverent about an egg in the peasant's kitchen. Small, fragile, and precious. Each one was a self-contained miracle. Hens didn't lay year-round, and when they did, their eggs were gathered with quiet gratitude. Most were eaten plainly, boiled hard, fried in lard if fortune smiled. But every now and then, a special meal was made: poached eggs in onion broth. Simple, elegant in its own rustic way, and deeply nourishing, this dish was a way to stretch a single egg into something that felt like ceremony. The broth came first. Onions, the peasant's eternal flavor, were sliced thin and browned slowly in a bit of fat, or simply simmered raw if none could be spared. The scent alone filled the cottage with warmth. The onions were cooked until soft and translucent, their sharpness mellowed by the heat, their sweetness coaxed out with patience. Water was added, along with a pinch of salt, or a splash of soured ale for those without. Sometimes herbs from the windowsill, thyme, marjoram, wild parsley, were tossed in to deepen the flavor. The broth simmered gently, never rushed. It needed time to come together, to turn simple ingredients into something savory and soothing. Then came the eggs, cracked carefully and slipped one by one into the steaming liquid. They curled into soft white clouds, yolks trembling like gold coins in the center. Poaching was delicate work. Too hot, and the eggs would toughen. Too cool, and they'd never set. When done right, the eggs floated like jewels in a bowl of fragrant onion broth, warm, tender, and glistening. The broth itself, soaked up with slices of stale barley bread or scooped with a wooden spoon, carried the richness of the egg and the sweetness of the onion in every sip. It was a meal meant to be eaten slowly, reverently, the kind of dish that turned heads when placed on the table, even if it took only a few ingredients to make. This was not food for feasting. It was food for healing, for comforting, for making someone feel seen. Mothers served it to children with fever. Wives made it for husbands returning from the field, and sometimes, on a rare, quiet morning, it was eaten in silence with thanks for another day of having enough. Poached eggs in onion broth reminded the eater that care could live in small things, that a single egg, when handled with patience and love, could become a meal that fed more than just the body. It fed the soul. Salted root vegetables. In the deep of winter, when gardens lay barren and the fields were hidden under frost, survival came from the cellar. And what lay waiting there, packed in barrels of brine or stacked in straw, were root vegetables, humble, knobby, and life-saving. Salted turnips, parsnips, carrots, and the occasional beet were the backbone of the cold season's meals. They were earthy, sharp, and not always pretty, but they carried with them the weight of preparation and the promise of endurance. Preserving roots was a necessity, not a luxury. Fresh vegetables were a memory by December, and if you hadn't planned ahead, there'd be nothing but hunger to greet you. So during harvest, the excess was packed away. The best roots were scrubbed clean and sliced or left whole, layered in coarse salt inside large clay jars or wooden barrels. Some households added herbs or vinegar to the mix, depending on regional tradition and what was available. Over weeks, the salt pulled out moisture and kept rot at bay, creating pickled, sour, tangy roots that stayed edible through the darkest months. These vegetables weren't delicate. Their texture was firm, sometimes rubbery, and their flavor bold, strong with salt, tinged with fermentation, and carrying the ghost of the summer soil. To eat them raw was a sharp experience, one that made the jaw work and the tongue sting. But when boiled or stewed, they softened beautifully, lending their unique punch to broths, stews, or even pottage. More often than not, they were simmered with onions and herbs, if any were left in the pantry. Sometimes a bit of fat was added to round out the flavors, or a crust of bread dropped into the pot to soak up the salt. A spoonful of sour ale or whey might brighten the dish. The result was a vegetable stew that was tangy, savory, and far more complex than its ingredients would suggest. Peasants ate it from wooden bowls, hot and steaming, with the windows iced and the wind howling outside. It wasn't glamour, it was grit. And each bite carried the memory of the long days of harvest, of the hands that had buried these roots in brine, knowing winter would come. Salted root vegetables weren't just food. They were foresight, frugality, and the reward for labor done before the snow fell. In every salty bite was a whisper. You planned, you worked, and because of that, you will last. Herb butter on flatbread. Sometimes, in a peasant's kitchen, luxury didn't come from coins or kings, but from a single cow and a patch of green herbs just outside the door. When milk was plentiful and the churn had worked its rhythm into the rhythm of the day, butter could be coaxed from cream. And when that butter met a fistful of crushed herbs, chervil, wild garlic, parsley, or thyme, it transformed into something golden, green-flecked, and utterly irresistible. Spread onto hot flatbread, it became one of the most quietly delightful meals a medieval peasant might hope for. Butter was not everyday fare. It took time, patience, and a steady supply of cream, which meant only those with a cow, or friendly relations with someone who did, could enjoy it with any frequency. Churning was often done by hand in wooden tubs, the cream sloshed and slapped back and forth until, like a miracle, it separated into butter and buttermilk. The butter was scooped and patted into shape, salted lightly if possible to help it keep. Some was stored, but some, especially in spring and early summer, was enjoyed fresh. To make herb butter, the freshest greens were chosen, picked just before use, washed clean and chopped fine with a knife, or crushed with a mortar. The herbs were stirred into the soft butter, still warm from the churn, and sometimes left to sit so the flavors could meld. Garlic greens were a favorite, lending a pungent brightness that cut through the fat. Chives gave a soft bite, while thyme or sage added an earthy note. Flatbread, simple and forgiving, was the perfect vehicle. Made from barley, rye, or oat flour mixed with water and rolled thin, it was cooked directly on hot stones or the hearth's edge. No yeast, no rise. Just a few minutes on each side until it puffed slightly and browned. When pulled from the heat and slapped with a spoonful of herb butter, it softened at the edges and soaked up the green richness into every warm fold. This was not a feast, but it felt like one. The scent of melting butter and crushed herbs filled the cottage. Children waited with open hands. Even the smallest piece of flatbread, when brushed with that bright, salty spread, became something to remember. It was warm, flavorful, fleeting. Herb butter on flatbread was a rare moment of ease. It didn't require meat or grain stores or complicated tools, just milk, herbs, and a fire. A soft green reminder that even the simplest things, when treated with care, could feed both body and spirit. Lentil and ale stew. When the weather turned wet and the cold crept into bones, nothing warmed a medieval peasant like a bowl of lentil and ale stew. It was a meal built on the sturdiness of legumes and the sharp comfort of leftover ale. Ingredients born of fields and fermentation, blended into something far richer than their price might suggest. In kitchens where meat was a rarity and every scrap had to count, this stew delivered warmth, fullness, and a taste that seemed almost festive. Lentils were a staple for many rural households. Small, quick to cook, and easy to store, they came in earthen tones, brown, green, red if you were lucky, and required nothing but water and patience to turn into a meal. They were usually boiled until soft and thick, their starches creating a natural creaminess. But the real magic came when ale entered the pot. Ale was everywhere in the medieval village. Weaker than today's brews, it was drunk daily. Safer than water, easier to make than wine. And when a batch turned too sour to drink, it didn't go to waste. That tangy, fermented liquid found new life in the cookpot, adding depth and bite to otherwise bland dishes. In lentil stew, it sharpened the flavors and added a rich, yeasty backbone that paired perfectly with herbs and onions. The base began with whatever fat could be spared, lard, drippings, or a splash of oil if the press had been kind. Onions were softened, garlic tossed in if there was any, and then the lentils were stirred in with water and a ladle of ale. Thyme or marjoram often found their way in, maybe even a bay leaf borrowed from the manor's edge. The stew simmered slowly, the lentils breaking down, the ale cooking off its sharpness, and leaving behind a warm, rounded flavor. Served thick or thin depending on the household's needs, it was ladled into bowls and eaten with coarse bread, the crusts dunked and dragged through the bottom to catch every bit. It wasn't fancy, but it had body. It had spirit, and on a long day, it filled the stomach and lifted the heart. Lentil and ale stew was the working man's comfort, simple, sustaining, and quietly bold. A pot of it meant the family would eat, the hunger would fade, and for a moment, the kitchen would hum with the warmth of something truly satisfying. Poached pears and spiced wine. When the orchard bore fruit and the pears hung heavy and golden on the branches, peasants knew to gather not just for now, but for the leaner days to come. Pears didn't keep as long as apples, so when the wind turned sharp and the cellar shelves groaned with root vegetables, the last of the ripened fruit found its way into the hearth pot, poached gently in wine, touched with spice if it could be spared, and served warm as a rare and radiant treat. Poached pears and spiced wine weren't an everyday dish. They were a glimmer of comfort on a feast day, a gift on a wedding morning, a gentle sweet after a hard season of harvest. If the village had pressed grapes that year, or the local monastery sold off a few casks, there might be a jug of weak red wine tucked in a cool corner. Not the fine wine of noble tables. This was rough, rustic, often halfway to vinegar. But in the pot, with a bit of care, it softened into something fragrant and tender. The pears were peeled and halved, their cores scooped clean with a spoon or the tip of a knife. Into the pot they went with the wine, a ladle of honey or a crumble of coarse sugar if the kitchen could spare it. A clove, a stick of cinnamon, or a shaving of ginger root might be tossed in, traded treasures from far-off lands, used so sparingly they might last the whole winter. Simmered low and slow, the pears took on the color of the wine, deep ruby or dusky plum, becoming soft, spoon-tender, and infused with warmth. The liquid thickened just enough to coat the fruit, the steam filling the cottage with a scent that seemed almost sinful in its richness. Served in wooden bowls, warm or cooled, the pears were eaten with fingers or spoons, their sweet spice lingering on the tongue. Bread was often dipped in the leftover syrup, soaking up the last of the flavor. For a moment, the meal felt lavish. Poached pears and spiced wine were more than dessert. They were a pause, a fragrant breath in a life of labor, a taste of distant lands made right in a humble pot. In a world where sweetness was rare and spice was sacred, this dish reminded peasants that even brief beauty was worth chasing, and that a pear, a pot, and a little patience could still make magic. Fried lentil balls, a meal made of earth and fire. The last dish in our journey is no feast, no grand finale meant to astonish. It's simple, modest even, but it carries with it the weight of centuries, of repetition, of human hands shaping food with the same motions, day after day, year after year. Fried lentil balls are the peasants' answer to what we now call falafel or croquettes, a dish that takes the most humble of ingredients and turns them into something unexpectedly rich, full of texture and flavor. They're not flashy, but they are deeply satisfying. And in a world where almost nothing came easy, that satisfaction meant everything. Let's start with the lentils. They weren't a flashy ingredient in the Middle Ages. They were dependable. Dried and stored in linen sacks or clay jars, they could sit on a shelf for months, waiting patiently until they were needed. And they were needed, frequently. Lentils didn't just fill the belly, they nourished it, offering protein and fiber in a world that often lacked both. For peasants who saw meat only a few times a year and lived on grains and roots the rest of the time, legumes were an essential part of staying upright and capable. But lentils boiled and spooned into a bowl can be dull after a while, monotonous even. And when you eat the same thing week after week, any variation becomes gold. That's where fried lentil balls came in. They were a change of pace, a small elevation. Not every household made them, and not every day allowed for the extra effort and use of cooking fat. But when they did appear, whether to mark the end of a fast, to feed visiting kin, or to make the most of the larder, they were a treat that brought people to the table with anticipation. The process began the day before. Dried lentils were soaked overnight in cold water, swelling slowly, softening for the cook's hand. Come morning, they were drained and either boiled until tender or left raw and pounded fine with a mortar. That method depended on time, fuel, and the desired texture. Boiled lentils made for a softer, more mash-like interior, while raw ones, ground into a coarse meal, gave the balls more bite and crunch. Either way, the end goal was a thick, sticky base that could be molded. To this base, flavor was added, not through spices from distant lands, but through what grew in reach. Onions, always. Chopped fine, sometimes caramelized in a pan before being added to the mix. Garlic, if available, was smashed and stirred in raw or roasted over the fire first. Then herbs, fresh in summer, dried in winter. Wild thyme, marjoram, parsley, even chopped dandelion greens or nettle if the season allowed. Sometimes a handful of barley flour or ground oats helped bind the mixture, absorbing moisture and giving structure. If the hens had laid that morning, a single egg might be cracked in to help hold it all together. And then came the shaping. Calloused hands rolled the mixture into balls, not perfectly round, but roughly uniform, about the size of a walnut. Placed gently on a wooden board or in a bowl of flour, they waited their turn for the fire. Now, frying was no small affair for a peasant. Cooking fat, be it lard from a slaughtered pig, rendered beef tallow, or even oil from pressed nuts or seeds, was precious. It was saved, reused, and only brought out when the occasion was worth it. But when a pan of fat did meet the fire, and the lentil balls were dropped in one by one, the transformation was remarkable. They sizzled, they crisped, their outer edges turned golden and brittle, while the insides stayed warm, soft, and herby. The smell was irresistible: sharp onion, earthy lentil, the faint, sweet bitterness of whatever greens were chopped into the mix. Children hovered close to the fire, drawn by the sound as much as the scent, their eyes wide with the promise of something warm and crisp. The balls were turned with a wooden spoon or stick, nudged and coaxed until all sides bore the same rich hue. Some split slightly, letting steam curl out from within. Others stayed perfectly sealed, little orbs of flavor and texture. When they were lifted from the fat, placed on cloth or bread to drain, they glistened, crackled faintly, and cooled just enough to be handled. They were eaten hot, usually by hand. Sometimes dipped in a sour vinegar sauce, sometimes alongside stewed greens, or simply with a slab of bread and a bowl of onion broth. They didn't need much dressing up. The crisp shell gave way to a creamy, savory inside, peppered with bits of onion and herb, deeply satisfying and surprisingly filling. And unlike many peasant meals, which were spooned from shared pots, these were portioned and passed, a food with boundaries, shape, intention. Leftovers, if there were any, kept well. Cooled and wrapped in cloth, they could be packed for a day in the fields, eaten cold with apples or pickled vegetables. Some families even crumbled them into soup the next day, adding heft to broth or thickening thin pottage. Fried lentil balls weren't born of celebration, necessarily. They were born of cleverness, of a cook who knew how to stretch a small bowl of legumes into something memorable. They marked effort and care. They made do, and then they made more. And in that, they captured the very heart of peasant cooking. To eat one today is to taste not just lentils and herbs and a bit of salt, but time, effort, frugality, the sound of laughter near a hearth, the hands of a mother pressing the mixture together, one ball at a time, the sizzle of fat, rare and carefully rationed, the joy of something crunchy in a soft world, something warm in cold hands. They may not look like much, but they are everything. Fried lentil balls close our journey, not because they are the grandest dish, but because they represent so clearly what this entire table has stood for: survival, shaped with love, flavored with patience, and shared with humility. They are, in every sense, a meal made of earth and fire, and a fitting final bite from the kitchens of the past. So there it was, 25 meals that once simmered in clay pots, smoked over open hearths, and fed generations, not with grandeur, but with grit. These dishes weren't built to impress, but to endure. They didn't sparkle with garnish or dazzle with technique. They were born of soil and sweat, of hunger and harvest, of the hard truth that food was never just food. It was survival, it was labor, it was love. Medieval peasants didn't eat with abundance. They ate with resourcefulness. They didn't throw things away because there was nothing to spare. Bones were boiled twice, crusts reborn in stew, and even the bitter acorn found its way into the bread. Every dish told a story, not of chefs and castles, but of mothers who made something out of nothing, fathers who tilled the fields by dawn, and children who learned early how far a turnip could stretch. What's striking, even today, is how much wisdom is baked into those bowls and loaves. These were meals designed for balance, long before modern nutrition named it. Pulses for protein, roots for energy, herbs for medicine, and fermentation for preservation. Nothing trendy, just timeless. And somehow, amidst the hardship, there was comfort. There was a steaming bowl of pottage on a frostbitten morning, a wedge of barley bread shared with a neighbor, a custard made with a few precious eggs, a poached pear warm with spice on a holy day. These weren't just meals, they were moments. They said, we are still here, we still have enough, we still feed each other. Today, we might look back and marvel at how they managed, but perhaps more importantly, we should take notes. In a world now filled with convenience and waste, there's something powerfully grounding about the peasant table, about slowing down, about using what's in front of us, about cooking with intention, however little we have. So if you ever find yourself with a sack of lentils, a basket of onions, and no idea what to do next, remember these dishes. They've fed people through famine, war, winter, and want, and they still have something to teach us. Because sometimes the most meaningful meals aren't the ones that dazzle the eye, but the ones that fill the bowl, quiet the hunger, and remind us, softly but firmly, that we are still capable of making something good out of very little. That's the true legacy of the medieval peasant kitchen: resilience, gratitude, and the quiet joy of enough.